Somewhere over the Pacific, a message had sat unsent in a draft folder for 14 hours. I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him about you. I just need you to still be there when I land. He never sent it. 3 weeks later, Junho Kang stood on a sidewalk in Manhattan, in front of the building he owned, staring up at the 31st floor like it was the only place on Earth he wasn't allowed to enter. And on that same floor, Amara Whitfield was already walking toward the elevator. Neither of them knew yet what the other had decided. Welcome back. If you watched part 1, you already know how this began. An intern who wasn't supposed to speak, and a CEO who couldn't stop choosing her. If this is your first time here, go watch part 1 first. This one won't hit the same without it. For everyone who's been waiting, subscribe with notifications on, because this episode ends on a cliffhanger that's going to make you need part 3 immediately. While you watch, I want to know in the comments, do you think Kang actually goes through with ending things? Let's get into it. Seoul didn't look like healing. It looked like a city Kang had spent his entire adult life running toward and away from in equal measure, and for the first 3 days after he landed, he barely left the family compound at all. He told himself it was jet lag. It wasn't. The flight had given him 14 hours to think, and he'd spent every one of them staring at the same 3 lines instead of sleeping. Somewhere over Alaska, he'd almost sent it. His thumb had hovered over the arrow for so long, the screen dimmed twice, before he finally locked the phone and set it face down on the tray table, telling himself he'd send it once he landed, once he'd had a shower, once he could think clearly, instead of running on recycled cabin air and the particular loneliness of economy-class silence in a first-class seat. He sat on the edge of his childhood bedroom, a room his father had never redecorated, still holding the trophies of a boy who used to believe loyalty and love were the same instinct, and opened his phone to the drafts folder more times than he wanted to admit. The message was still there, unsent, waiting, the way things wait when you're too afraid to finish them. I'll tell him the truth. I'll tell him about you. I just need you to still be there when I land. He read it on the plane. He read it in the car from the airport. He read it now, at 2 a.m. Seoul time, sitting in the dark with the lights of the city bleeding faintly through the curtains. And every time he read it, the same question rose up behind it, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. Why didn't I send it? He told himself it was strategy. A man doesn't walk into a conversation with his father holding an unfinished promise. Better to resolve one battle before starting another. That was the version of the truth he could live with at 9 a.m, in a suit, across a table from his father's advisors. At 2 a.m., alone, the excuse didn't hold. The real answer sat underneath it, smaller and harder to look at directly. He wasn't sure the promise was true. Not because he didn't want Amara. Wanting her had never been the problem. The problem was the shape of the wanting. Every time he tried to separate the woman from the memory she'd resurrected in him, he found himself standing at the edge of a question he'd never had to ask about anyone else in his life. Do I love her? Or do I love what she reminds me I lost? He set the phone face down on the desk, like that alone might silence it. His mother's photograph, the one he'd given Amara before he left, used to sit in that same desk drawer for 15 years, untouched, unseen by anyone. He'd handed it to a woman he'd known for 6 weeks like it was nothing, like it hadn't cost him something to let it out of his hands. That wasn't nothing. He knew that. He also knew that knowing it didn't make the doubt go away. A knock came at the door before dawn. His assistant, apologetic, informing him the chairman wanted breakfast with both of his sons before the day's business began. Kang dressed in silence, tied his tie without looking in the mirror, and told himself, one more time, that he would send the message before the day was over. He didn't send it that day either. Instead, he sat across from his father over rice and grilled fish he barely tasted, his younger brother Min-ho beside him scrolling through a tablet of shipping manifests, and rehearsed in his head the version of the conversation he actually needed to have, the one about the marriage his father had spent 2 years quietly building, and the woman 8,000 miles away who had no idea her name was about to be spoken out loud in a language she didn't understand, in a house she would probably never see. Min-ho caught him staring at nothing over breakfast more than once. "You're doing the thing," his brother said finally, not unkindly. "What thing?" The thing where you disappear behind your own face. You used to only do it before board meetings. Now you do it over rice. Minho set down his chopsticks. Is it the marriage? Or is it something else? Kang didn't answer. His silence answered for him, the way it always did with the one person in his family who'd learned to read it fluently. He didn't know, sitting there, that on the other side of the world, Amara was staring at her own phone at that exact hour, 3 a.m., New York time, reading the last text he'd sent her before he boarded the plane, wondering the same thing he was. Why does it feel like something already ended, before either of us said it did? Neither of them said it out loud yet. Neither of them was ready to be the one who was wrong about what the silence meant. So the unsent message stayed exactly where it was, folded into a drafts folder on a phone in a dark room in Seoul, waiting for a version of Kang who hadn't been born yet, one who knew what he wanted badly enough to stop being careful about it. The trouble in the newsroom didn't announce itself with a headline. It started, the way most trouble does, with a closed-door meeting Amara wasn't invited to. Douglas Feldman, Meridian's general counsel, had a simple job: protect the network from liability. And a promotion that skipped every normal channel, granted by the CEO to a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks, wasn't a story he cared about personally. It was a legal exposure he couldn't ignore. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," he told Grant Sorensen, the head of HR, in a glass office on the executive floor. "I'm saying if this ever becomes a lawsuit, favoritism, discrimination, a competitor claiming the position should have gone through proper channels, we need a paper trail showing due diligence. That's it. That's the whole ask." Grant, a careful man who had spent 11 years keeping Meridian's internal politics from becoming external scandals, agreed reluctantly. A quiet review, nothing punitive, just documentation, performance metrics, comparisons to other candidates who'd been passed over, confirmation that the promotion held up on merit alone. "You understand what this looks like from the outside," Grant said, more to himself than to Feldman, sliding the request into a folder he already knew wouldn't stay quiet for long. A file with her name on it, opened the week the CEO leaves the country. "It looks like due diligence," Feldman said, "as long as it stays contained." It should have stayed exactly that contained. It didn't, because Vanessa Cole heard about it before the ink on the request was dry. Vanessa had been at Meridian 4 years, chasing the same kind of recognition Amara had been handed in 11 days, and she wasn't shy about who she thought deserved it more. She wasn't cruel by nature, she told herself, and anyone who'd listen, that she simply believed in earning things, but belief has a way of curdling into something uglier when it goes unrewarded long enough. "They're already investigating her," Vanessa said to Priya at the coffee station, loud enough to carry. "Legal wants proof it wasn't just," she paused for effect, "personal." Priya, who had softened toward Amara since their break room conversation, didn't take the bait this time. "You don't know that. I know Feldman doesn't open a compliance file for fun." By the end of the week, the quiet review wasn't quiet anymore. It had a name in hallway conversations, the Whitfield inquiry, and a life of its own that had almost nothing to do with the actual documents Grant Sorensen was patiently compiling in a locked folder nobody outside his office had access to. Amara felt the temperature of the room change before she understood why. Conversations paused a half-second too long when she approached. An editor who'd praised her work 2 weeks earlier suddenly needed everything double-checked. A junior producer who used to ask her opinion on graphics now routed those same questions around her, to Vanessa, without explanation. Amara found out about it the way she found out about most things at Meridian now, secondhand, and too late to control the narrative. "They pulled my performance file," she told Deshawn in the stairwell, the same stairwell where he'd once handed her half a sandwich and told her not to believe stupid rumors. This time there was no sandwich, just her arms crossed tight against her chest and a look on her face that hadn't been there in weeks. "Compared me against candidates I didn't even know existed. Nobody told me. I found out because Grant's assistant CC'd me on an email by accident. It's probably just, don't." Her voice cracked slightly, more from exhaustion than anger. "I know what it's probably just. I also know what it looks like. And he's not even here to tell them any different." That was the part that hurt worst, and she hated herself a little for admitting it. even in her own head. Not the investigation itself. She could survive scrutiny. She'd survived it her whole life, walking into rooms nobody expected her in. What she couldn't survive gracefully was doing it alone, without the one person who actually knew the truth standing beside her to say so. She hadn't told Kang about any of it yet. Every time they spoke, she found a reason not to bring it up. He sounded tired, distracted, carrying weight of his own she couldn't see the shape of from this distance. She told herself she was protecting him from one more problem. The truth, quieter and less flattering, was that some small, frightened part of her was afraid of what it would mean if she told him, and he didn't rush to defend her the way she needed him to. So she said nothing, and went back to her desk, and tried to make herself small enough that the whispers would find someone else to feed on. They didn't. It came to a head on a Thursday, in the copy room, when Amara reached for the same printer Vanessa was standing at, and Vanessa didn't bother lowering her voice for the benefit of the two junior staffers nearby. "Must be nice," Vanessa said, not quite looking at her, "having a legal team build your case for you, while the rest of us have to actually earn our bylines." Amara set her folder down slowly, giving herself a full second to choose her next words, instead of reaching for the first ones that came. "You think Grant Sorensen is building my case?" "He's the one who opened the file, Vanessa. If you actually think this is going my way, you haven't been paying attention." "I think," Vanessa said, turning to face her fully now, "that in 4 years here, nobody has ever pulled my performance file and compared me to 5 other candidates without telling me first. That doesn't happen to people who earned what they have. It happens to people everyone's already quietly decided didn't. Then wait for the report." Amara's voice stayed level, though her pulse hadn't. "Because when it clears me, and it will, I'd love to hear what you tell people then. If it clears you." "When?" Amara picked her folder back up. "You can keep saying if out loud if it makes you feel better. I've got a story to finish." She walked out before her voice could betray anything closer to the fear she actually felt, and made it almost to the stairwell door before she let her hands start shaking. Grant Sorensen's review, meanwhile, crept toward its conclusion with the unhurried pace of a man determined not to let hallway noise dictate his timeline. He'd interviewed 4 other candidates who'd been passed over for the lead reporter title before Amara's promotion. He'd pulled 6 weeks of her published work and run it against Meridian's own internal scoring rubric, the same one used for every reporter's annual review. Twice, he found himself staying later than he needed to, simply because the numbers kept refusing to say what half the newsroom had already decided they would. He hadn't told anyone which way the report was leaning. Not Feldman, not his own assistant, and certainly not Amara, who caught his eye once across the newsroom and got nothing back but a small, unreadable nod that told her absolutely nothing and kept her up half that night wondering what it meant. Amara's apartment in Queens had never felt this quiet before. She sat on the edge of her bed at midnight with her grandmother's old quilt pulled over her knees, phone in hand, scrolling back through 3 weeks of text messages like she could find some clue she'd missed the first 10 times she'd read them. There wasn't one, just ordinary sentences that had started to feel like a countdown she didn't understand the number for. "Good night, talk tomorrow, long day. You? Missed the second coffee. Nobody here drinks it right." That last one had made her laugh out loud when he sent it, alone in this same apartment, a week and a half ago. She'd read it 4 times before she let herself believe it meant what she wanted it to mean. She still believed it. That was the strange, quiet, terrifying thing she'd finally admitted to herself somewhere in the last few days, in the specific kind of honesty that only shows up after midnight when there's no one around to perform for. She was falling in love with her boss. Not almost. Not maybe. Already there, standing in it, no longer able to pretend the ground under her feet was anything else. It should have scared her more than it did. Maybe it would have, if the ache of missing him hadn't been so much louder than the fear. "I don't need this to make sense right now," she thought, staring at the ceiling. "I just need him to come home." She thought about calling her mother in Charlotte, the way she used to when a boy confused her in college, and decided against it. Some things felt too new, too fragile, too much like they might dissolve the second she said them out loud, to someone who would ask questions she didn't have answers for yet. Is he single? Is this appropriate? Does he know what he's risking by promoting you? She wasn't ready to defend something she hadn't even fully named to herself. During the day, she was careful to be nothing but professional. Steady voice in meetings, sharp instincts on the corruption story, no trace of the woman who lay awake rereading old texts. It was a kind of performance she'd gotten good at without meaning to, the same instinct that had gotten her through every room that had ever doubted her. Nobody in that newsroom, watching her calmly field another pointed question from Vanessa, could have guessed that the version of her sitting alone at midnight ached the way it did. 6,000 miles away, in a city that never fully went dark, Kang wasn't sleeping either. He stood at the window of his father's guest house with a glass of water he hadn't touched, replaying a version of the same ache from the opposite direction. He didn't doubt that he missed her. That part was simple, embarrassingly simple, for a man who prided himself on never being simple about anything. He missed the sound of her arguing with him about sentence structure. He missed the exact way she left a second coffee on his desk without ever mentioning that she'd done it. He missed the weight of the half-inch of space between them on the rooftop, the one neither of them had closed, the one he now suspected he'd been a coward for not closing. What he doubted, what kept him standing at that window at 2 different hours across 2 different nights instead of sleeping, was whether missing someone was the same thing as loving them, or whether it was just the shape grief takes when it finally finds somewhere new to live. A good boss doesn't fall for his own reporter over 6 weeks, he told himself, and hated how much it sounded like his father's voice instead of his own. A good boss doesn't confuse memory for feeling. He picked up his phone, opened her contact, typed, deleted, typed again. I keep thinking about the rooftop. Deleted. I don't know what I'm doing without you here. Deleted. In the end, he sent the same 3 words he'd been sending most nights, safe and small enough to survive his own hesitation. Thinking of you. Her reply came faster than he expected, like she'd been waiting with the phone already in her hand. Always. Come home soon. He stared at those 4 words longer than any businessman had a right to stare at anything, and did not send the message still sitting untouched in his drafts folder, the one that had been waiting since the plane. He told himself there would be time for that later. He was starting to suspect he didn't fully believe himself anymore. They talked properly 2 nights later, an actual call instead of texts, her voice warm and familiar through the static of an international connection. For the first 10 minutes, it was easy the way it used to be. She told him about a source who'd finally gone on record. He asked real questions about the story, instead of polite ones, and for a moment, neither of them sounded like 2 people carrying separate weights on opposite sides of the planet. Then she asked, lightly, not expecting much of an answer, "How's Seoul treating you?" And something in his voice changed before he'd even decided to let it. "Busy," he said. "The usual. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now." A pause stretched too long to be comfortable. "There's a lot happening here. Work, family things. I don't want to bore you with it." Amara sat with the phone against her ear, staring at the dark window of her apartment, and felt the shape of something shift without being able to name what it was. He'd never once called anything about himself boring to her before. If anything, he'd told her things in the last 6 weeks he'd told almost no one. His mother, his doubts, the parts of himself he kept locked behind that corner office door. "You sure that's all it is?" she asked. "You sound different tonight." "I'm tired, Amara. That's all it is." His voice softened at the end, just enough to sound like an apology for the sharpness before it. "I promise. Just the workload catching up with me." She wanted to push. Some instinct, the same one that had caught a 14% error in a room full of professionals who'd missed it, told her there was more sitting underneath his answer than jet lag and business meetings. But she also knew what it felt like to be far from home, exhausted, carrying more than anyone around you understood, and she chose, in that moment, to give him the same grace she'd have wanted for herself. "Okay," she said softly. "I trust you. Just don't disappear on me completely, all right? Whatever it is." "I won't." He meant it when he said it. He wasn't entirely sure, hanging up the phone a few minutes later, that it was still true. The morning of the conversation, Kang stood in the courtyard of the family compound long before breakfast, watching his father walk the same stone path he'd walked every morning, for as long as Kang could remember. A ritual older than the company itself, older than the grief that had reshaped their family the year Kang turned 20. "You've been quiet since you landed," his father said, without turning around, the way he always seemed to know exactly where his son was standing. "I've had a lot to think about." "You always have a lot to think about. That's not new." His father finally turned, studying him with the particular attention he usually reserved for negotiations. "Walk with me." They walked in silence for a while, past the koi pond his mother had insisted on installing the year before she died, past the small shrine where her photograph, a different one, a formal portrait, not the one Kang had given away, still sat with fresh flowers his father replaced every week without fail, 12 years running. "Your brother tells me you haven't slept properly since you got here," his father said eventually. "My brother talks too much. Your brother worries too much. There's a difference." His father stopped at the edge of the pond, hands folded behind his back. "Whatever it is, Junho, I'd rather hear it from you before the board hears a version of it from someone else." That was as close to an invitation as his father ever gave, and Kang recognized it for what it was. He didn't answer yet. He simply nodded, and they walked back toward the house together, and by the time they sat down for tea an hour later, Kang had decided he was finally going to say the whole truth out loud, to the one man whose opinion had shaped every decision he'd ever made. The conversation Kang had been avoiding finally happened over tea, not confrontation. His father had never been a man who raised his voice to make a point land harder. "You're declining the O arrangement," his father said. It wasn't a question. Chairman Kang Dae-hyun had built an empire reading rooms before anyone spoke in them. "I am." Kang kept his voice even. "I'll find another way to secure the shipping agreement. A joint venture, a licensing deal. There are 5 paths to the same outcome that don't require a wedding." He braced for the response he'd spent his whole life bracing for. It didn't come. "Good," his father said instead, setting down his cup. "I never wanted a wedding either. I wanted the roots. The wedding was simply the fastest tool I had. If you found a better one, use it." Min-ho, sprawled in the chair beside them with the ease of a younger son, who'd never carried the full weight his brother had, raised an eyebrow. "That easy?" "Nothing about this family is easy," their father said. "But I am not interested in forcing my son into a marriage he doesn't want. For a business deal I can solve 3 other ways. I raised you to be smarter than that. Apparently it worked." For a moment, relief nearly undid the careful composure Kang had worn, like armor for 3 days. Then his father asked the question that undid it completely. "Is there someone else?" Kang could have lied. He'd lied to that room before, about smaller things, and been believed. He found, in that moment, that he didn't want to. "There's a woman," he said, "at the network. I promoted her. Not because of the deal, not because of anything strategic. Because of how she reminded me of Uma." His voice caught slightly on the word, the one he almost never used out loud. "And now I don't know if what I feel for her is real, or if I've spent 6 weeks projecting a woman I lost onto someone who happened to remind me of her at the right moment." Min-ho's confusion showed plainly on his face. Not judgment, just the honest bewilderment of a man who had never had to ask himself a question that complicated. Their father's expression was harder to read, older, more careful. "You're asking the wrong question," his father finally said. "You're asking whether the feeling is pure enough to trust." "Nothing is pure enough to trust. Junho, I loved your mother for 31 years, and I still could not have told you, on any given day, how much of that love was about who she was, and how much was about who I needed her to be. Love isn't clean, it never was. The only real question is whether you're willing to keep choosing her, on the days the feeling isn't loud enough to make the decision for you. And if I choose wrong, then you'll be human, like the rest of us." His father almost smiled, the same restrained, private almost smile Kang recognized in himself, in the mirror, in every photo of them side by side. "I'd rather you take that risk than come home in 20 years and tell me you never let yourself find out." Min-ho, quieter now, set down his tablet. "For what it's worth, whatever you decide, I've got your back. I always have." Kang left Seoul 2 days later with the marriage arrangement formally declined, his father's blessing sitting strangely heavy in his chest, and the doubt still fully intact, because his father's advice, as wise as it was, hadn't actually answered the question keeping him up at night. It had only reframed it. At the airport, Minho hugged him once, briefly, in the stiff way their family showed affection in public. "Whatever you decide about her," his brother said quietly, "decide it because you mean it, not because you're scared of what happens if you don't." Kang didn't answer. He boarded the plane, still not knowing which fear was actually driving him. Am I willing to keep choosing her, even on the days it isn't loud enough to be simple? He didn't know yet. He was starting to fear the answer was no, not because he didn't want her, but because he wasn't sure a man who ran a company built on his mother's memory had any business gambling someone else's career on a feeling he couldn't fully trust. Back in New York, Amara had made a decision of her own, quieter than Kang's, but no less deliberate. She was done waiting for anyone else to settle the question of whether she deserved her seat. She threw herself into the real estate corruption story the way she'd once buried herself in zoning archives for fun as an intern, not to prove anything to the people whispering about her, though she'd have been lying if she said that thought never crossed her mind, but because the story mattered, and because it was the one part of this entire upside-down season of her life that was still fully, undeniably hers. The developer's lawyers had escalated their threats. Meridian's advertising department was nervous. Grant Sorensen's quiet compliance review was still sitting open in the background of every room she walked into. And still, night after night, Amara kept building the story brick by brick. Verified documents, a second source willing to go on record, a paper trail so airtight even Feldman's lawyers stopped trying to find holes in it. "You know this is going to run whether the review clears you or not," Grant told her one evening, catching her in the hallway with the kind of honesty that surprised her. "For what it's worth, I've read your file twice now. Every metric on it stands on its own. I don't know why Kang promoted you the day he did. I know your work since then earned it independently. I'll be putting that in my report." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full vote of confidence, but it was the first time anyone inside that investigation had said her competence out loud instead of just her circumstances, and Amara held on to it longer than she expected to. The report itself landed in her inbox 3 days later, 5 pages long, dry and procedural in the way only a compliance document could be, and utterly, finally clear in its conclusion. Performance metrics justified the promotion, independent of any other factor. No violation of policy found. Amara read it twice, sitting alone at her desk, and felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't fully realized had been clenched for 3 weeks straight. It wasn't vindication, exactly. She'd never doubted the work itself. It was simply the relief of watching the last official voice in the room finally say what she'd known all along. In writing. Permanent. Impossible to whisper away. She didn't celebrate. She forwarded it to no one, told no one but Deshawn, and went straight back to her desk to keep working, because the story still mattered more than the vindication did. But she kept a printed copy in the bottom drawer of her desk anyway, folded once, the way people keep things they never plan to need again, but can't quite bring themselves to throw away. The developer's second lawyer called Meridian's front desk twice that week, each time asking to speak to whoever is actually in charge of this story, as if a woman's byline alone made the threat easier to dismiss. Amara took both calls herself, calm and unshaken, reciting back the exact documents her sources had already verified until the lawyer ran out of things to threaten her with. Feldman, listening from the doorway of the adjoining office the second time, said nothing, but he stopped attaching Amara's name to his liability emails after that. Priya found her later that night, both of them alone in the newsroom, the way Amara and Kang had once been. "I owe you something closer to an actual apology," Priya said, sitting on the edge of the desk. "Not for asking questions. I still think people had a right to ask questions, for assuming I already knew the answer before I did. You believe me now? I believe your work now. That story you're about to run is going to be the biggest thing this network's published in 2 years. Nobody sleeps their way into sourcing like that." Priya almost smiled. "Whatever's actually going on with you and Kang, that's your business. But nobody's going to be able to say you didn't earn this desk. Not after this week." Amara let herself feel that, fully, for the first time since the whole strange chapter of her life had begun. Not relief that the doubt was gone, because it wasn't, Not completely, not even in her own head, but something steadier than relief. The quiet, hard-won knowledge that whatever came next, with Kang or without him, she had built something in that newsroom that belonged to her and no one else. The story ran 2 nights later, top of the broadcast, her name on the byline, in letters bigger than any she'd had before. Within an hour, 2 other outlets had picked it up. Within a day, a city council member had resigned. Amara stood in the newsroom, watching her own segment play back on the wall of monitors, surrounded by people who, 3 weeks earlier, had been whispering about how she got her job, now asking her for quotes on a follow-up piece. Vanessa didn't apologize. She didn't need to. She simply stopped bringing it up, which, in that newsroom, was its own kind of concession. She still wanted him to come home. That hadn't changed, and she'd stopped pretending to herself that it would. But for the first time in weeks, wanting him and needing him to make her whole were 2 separate things, and she was starting to understand the difference. The flight back to New York was 14 hours, and Kang spent most of them staring at a single unsent message he'd finally decided he was never going to send. He'd heard, through the same executive channels that made privacy nearly impossible at Meridian, about the review, about Vanessa Cole's whispers hardening into something closer to consensus among a certain slice of the newsroom, about the shape the rumor had taken in his absence, not she got lucky, but something crueler, something that questioned not just her promotion but her character, in a way that would follow her long after any compliance report cleared her name. He hadn't caused that directly. He knew that. He also knew, with the particular clarity that comes from 30,000 feet and too many hours to think, that he was the reason it existed at all, and that anything more between them now, anything the newsroom could point to as confirmation, would make it worse for her, not better. Permanently. In a way a cleared HR file could never fully undo. He thought about calling his brother, asking him to say again the thing he'd said in the guest house, "Whatever you decide, I've got your back," but decided against it. This wasn't a decision he could borrow someone else's certainty for. It had to be his, clean, whatever it cost him. Somewhere over Greenland, exhaustion finally caught up with him, and he drifted into the kind of half-sleep that doesn't quite let go of consciousness, where memory plays back uninvited. He saw the rooftop again. Not the interruption, not the assistant bursting through the door, but the moment just before it, her breath visible in the cold, the half-inch of space he hadn't closed. He saw her asleep at her desk with his coat over her shoulders, the particular stillness of a woman who trusted the room enough to let her guard down in it. He saw his mother's photograph sitting on Amara's desk, entrusted to hands he'd never let hold anything that fragile before. He woke somewhere over Canada, with his jaw tight and his decision no less certain, but heavier now, the way decisions get heavier once memory has had its say. She built something real in that newsroom on her own, he thought, watching the clouds shift outside his window. If I walk back in and claim her the way I want to, I don't protect that, I erase it. Everyone will stop talking about her work and start talking about us, forever, no matter how good the story is. It was, he told himself, the only decision a responsible man could make. He was her CEO. Whatever he felt, and he no longer had the energy to keep pretending he didn't feel it, fully, undeniably, in a way that had nothing left to do with his mother's memory, and everything to do with a woman who left him coffee and argued about sentence structure like it was foreplay. None of that mattered if the cost was her name attached to a scandal for the rest of her career. I'll end it before it becomes something either of us can't undo. I'll tell her it's for her. Because it is. He almost believed that was the whole truth. Almost. Somewhere underneath the noble reasoning, quieter and harder to face, sat the same doubt that had followed him from Seoul to the plane to this exact moment. The fear that he wasn't ending it to protect her at all, but to protect himself from finding out, on some ordinary Tuesday 6 months from now, that what he felt for her had quietly become nothing more than an echo after all. He didn't examine that fear closely enough to answer it. It was easier, he found, to call the decision love, and let it look like sacrifice. By the time the plane touched down at JFK, he had rehearsed the words he planned to say to her at least a dozen times, each version colder than the one before it. each one a little further from the man who had told her, on a rooftop 3 weeks ago, that he had already made his choice. He believed, walking off that plane, that this was still true. New York greeted him the way it always did after time away, indifferent, loud, entirely unconcerned with whatever quiet war a man had been fighting with himself for 3 weeks. He stood at baggage claim watching other travelers fall into the arms of the people waiting for them, and felt, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, entirely alone in a city he owned a piece of. He was about to find out how much harder it is to end something than it ever was to begin it. He arrived outside the Meridian building the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the skyline, and stood on the sidewalk exactly where he'd stood 3 weeks earlier in his own imagination, except now it was real, and his legs didn't seem to remember how to carry him through the doors he owned. He'd landed the night before and gone straight to an empty apartment instead of coming to the office, telling himself he needed a night to compose the right words. He hadn't slept. He'd sat at his kitchen table with a legal pad, the way he used to draft difficult board resolutions, and tried to write down exactly what he needed to say to her, clean, final, kind enough not to wound her more than necessary, firm enough that neither of them would be tempted to talk him out of it. He'd filled 2 pages and thrown both away. By 6 a.m. he'd given up on writing it and simply gotten dressed, telling himself the words would come once he was standing in front of her, the way they always had before, except nothing about this felt like it had before. Every other time he'd walked into that building, he'd known exactly who he was the moment he crossed the threshold. This morning, for the first time since he'd taken over the company, he wasn't sure the man walking through those doors and the man who'd promoted an intern 6 weeks ago were still the same person. He rehearsed it one more time. It's not fair to you, to your career, to the story you built without me. I need you to hear that this is about protecting what you earned, not about what I feel. He believed every word of it. He also, standing there with his hands cold in his coat pockets, felt something that felt very little like conviction and very much like grief, arriving early for something that hadn't happened yet. A car pulled up behind him, his driver, right on schedule, ready to take him the rest of the way to the underground entrance he usually used. Kang waved him off. Whatever was about to happen, he decided, he wasn't going to do it hidden in a private elevator. If this was truly ending, it should end somewhere she could see him coming. Above him, 31 floors up, Amara stood at the glass wall of the newsroom, with a coffee going cold in her hand, exactly like the first night he'd found her there. She'd come in early too, unable to sleep, telling herself it was only about finishing edits on her follow-up piece, and not at all about the fact that his flight had landed the night before, and she'd checked the tracker 3 times before finally putting the phone down. She saw the car first, the same black car from the night he left, and then she saw him wave it away, and then she saw him, small and still on the sidewalk below, staring up at the building like he wasn't sure it would let him back in. Something about the stillness of him, the way he stood there instead of walking straight in the way the Junho Kang she knew always did, told her before anything else could that this wasn't going to be a simple homecoming. She didn't wait for him to text her. She didn't wait for Grant's report, or Priya's opinion, or the last of the whispers still trailing her through the hallways. 3 weeks of missing him collapsed into a single, uncomplicated instinct, the kind that doesn't leave room for doubt, even when doubt has been the whole story for everyone else involved. She set the coffee down on the nearest desk and walked toward the elevator. Kang, still standing on the sidewalk with the speech he no longer fully believed sitting heavy in his chest, watched the doors of the building start to slide open. He thought, absurdly, of his father's words in the courtyard. The only real question is whether you're willing to keep choosing her on the days the feeling isn't loud enough to make the decision for you. He'd flown 8,000 miles believing he already had his answer. Standing here now, watching the elevator numbers begin their slow descent from 31, he wasn't sure anymore whether the answer he was about to give her was the true one, or simply the one that had been easiest to rehearse alone on an airplane where she couldn't see his face. The doors of the lobby elevator chimed once, twice, counting down floor after floor, 30, 25, 20, the numbers falling the way his certainty had been falling since the moment he'd waved his driver away. He didn't know yet what he was going to say when she walked through them. He was starting to fear he already knew what she deserved to hear, and that it wasn't the version he'd rehearsed on the plane. And that's where we leave them. Doors opening, 3 weeks of everything unsaid about to collide. If your heart is in your throat right now, that means this series is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll hear the second part 3 drops, because it's going to answer whether Kang actually says the words he flew home to say. Comment below, do you think Amara walks into that lobby ready to fight for him, or ready to walk away first? I read every comment, and I promise it shapes how I write these. Like this video if you need part 3 right now, and I'll see you there.